What was the impact of Mikhail Gorbachev on U.S. Russian relations? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's Libertarian Angle as we examine that question. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you all the principled and compromising case for the libertarian philosophy, as we've done here for 32 years at the Future of Freedom Foundation. I'm joined, as I am most weeks, by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, who is a professor of economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again.
Good to see you and to be with our viewers and listeners.
Yeah, nice to be here with you all. If you're new to FFF, come and visit us at fff.org and subscribe to our FFF Daily, which is free for the asking, our monthly journal, which is not free, but is a very reasonable cost, and of course, this YouTube channel. Okay, Richard, so the big news in international affairs is the passing of Mikhail Gorbachev, the last leader of the Soviet Union. Significant man. It played a big role in history, especially with respect to U.S. Russia relations or U.S. Soviet relations. And the way I see it is there's sort of two significant aspects to this passing. One is, the role that Gorbachev played in the Soviet system and the role he played in bringing an end to the Cold War. And then the Cold War itself, what that meant in terms of the American people and what it has meant ever since. So why don't I, since you were a real expert on the Soviet Union and the Soviet system, especially throughout the Cold War, why don't I pass it on over to you and tell us what was the significance of Mikhail Gorbachev?
Well, of course, his internationally recognized significance is that he was the last general secretary of the Soviet Communist Party. He was appointed after the rather rapid succession of a variety of other prior leaders. Brezhnev died, Chernenko died, Andropov died. Andropov had previously been the head of the KGB, and earlier in 1956, he was the Soviet official in charge who, under Khrushchev, crushed the Hungarian Revolution of 1956 rather brutally. Andropov had also been the one who had instituted putting dissidents into mental institutions. But with Andropov's passing, like I said, after a succession of aging geriatric Soviet leaders, the Soviet Communist Party, in their own secret ways at that time, appointed Mikhail Gorbachev, relatively young man, the youngest head of the Soviet system in literally multiple of decades. And he began to institute a series of reforms, both domestic and foreign, which, since many of the viewers and listeners may not recall, may have been not even around then, since this is all well over 30, 35 years ago. He instituted two policies at home, what he called glasnost and perestroika. Glasnost is a Russian word that has a general meaning of openness. The Soviet system was based upon secrecy and dictatorial propaganda to justify, rationalize the system, and to put under the rug anything that the regime did not want the people to know. And he suddenly said that there were to be no blank pages in Soviet history. And while it was a little bit ticklish, really, to criticize Lenin, the founder of the Soviet system with the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, it became increasingly fair game to unearth and publicize the, quote, the sins of Stalin fully, from the time Stalin came to power in 1928 until his death in 1953. The result is that you'd have these exposés in Russian Soviet newspapers on mass murders, the trumped up purge trials. No, these are things that historians in the West access and been published to the informed reader in the West. But this was revelation in terms of the details to the Soviet population, the way people would be tortured, the way they would be imprisoned, the numbers in the millions who had suffered this fate, the string of slave labor camps known as the Gulag Archipelago, is reflecting the title that Solzhenitsyn had given to his famous work. The admission of that the Soviet Union under Stalin had basically set up the stage for the beginning of the Second World War in Europe in 1939, by Stalin not only signing a non-aggression pact with Hitler in August of 1939, but that it had the secret protocol to divide up Eastern Europe in case of war, which occurred. And Gorbachev admitting that following the mutual invasion of Poland in 1939 and the division of the country in the Soviet zone, well over 10,000 Polish officers and others were rounded up and taken to the Soviet Union and mass murdered. The famous Katyn Forest massacre. The Poles had always accused the Soviet Union of this. The Soviets had denied it, and Gorbachev admitted it. So this was like revelations, an intellectual and public breath of fresh air. The other element of that he introduced was called perestroika. This was basically reforms of the Soviet economy. And here it needs to be clarified. From the beginning, Gorbachev remained a determined Marxian socialist. He greatly admired Lenin. He believed that the system had to return to the roots that Lenin wanted and would have continued if only Lenin hadn't died in 1924. So what he wanted to create was socialism with a human face, not closed, not brutal, creating sort of incentives for degrees of small private enterprise, making state factories more accountable and competitive, but all within the framework of a general government-mandated, government-planned, government-controlled economic system. So this itself meant that in both little and sometimes great ways, the economic circumstances of the people dramatically improved. Food could be bought in private markets more openly. Small businesses cropped up that might have still had to pay bribes and had to watch what they did, but this was all new. But in all of this setting, his goal was to save the Soviet system, not to abolish it, not to overthrow it, not to see its ending, but to save it by introducing reforms, both the political, civil liberty issues of speaking the truth about certain things, and degrees of small private enterprise adaptability within the wider Soviet planned economy to get the system going and following it. Now, if one hears the news about his death, which the media has been covering today, they would say, Jacob, he was a man of peace. He didn't want to be brutal like his successors. The fact is, it is absolutely true that in 1989, he let the Berlin Wall fall. It is absolutely true that he publicly told the East German authorities that he would not send in Soviet soldiers to save their system, nor would he do anything to maintain the Soviet empire in any of the other Eastern European countries, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria. So in short order, all of them began to see revolutions overthrowing the puppet Soviet regimes that had been set up in all of these Eastern European countries by Stalin at the end of the Second World War. But what Gorbachev was unwilling to see was the dismemberment and the dismantling of the Soviet Union as a political entity itself. So as a consequence, when there were nationalist and political demonstrations and resistance movements in Azerbaijan and Georgia in southern European Soviet Union, in the Caucasus Mountains, when the Lithuanians, and to a less aggressive sense at the time, the Latvians and the Estonians, insisted upon regaining their national independence, which they had lost in 1940 due to Stalin's pact with Hitler. He was not willing to put up with this. He used violence soldiers were sent in. People were injured or killed. The most publicized one was in January 1991, which I personally witnessed. We've talked about this before and previously. When I was in Vilnius, Lithuania, and the Soviets sent in the tanks. 13 people were killed one night as they were attempting to crush the independence movement, and they were rounding people up. But the fact is that he could not hold back the desire for people to be free of the system, politically and increasingly economically. But the consequence was that there was a hardline coup attempt in August of 1991 to overthrow him and to return the Soviet Union itself to a more hardline Stalin aura. But it failed, fortunately, after 3 days. But as a consequence of this, the hero of the day was not Gorbachev, but Boris Yeltsin, who was the president of the Soviet Russian Federation. And he basically brought about a situation, without going into all the detail for our purposes, in which Gorbachev was humiliated and had to resign, with the end result that on Christmas Eve 1991, with his formal resignation, the Soviet Union was dismantled. And the 14 constituent republics of the Soviet Union all became independent countries. And the core and largest one, Soviet Russia, became the Russian Federation, an independent government, an independent country, along with Ukraine and Belarus and the Baltic republics, and Kazakhstan and the other Central Asian republics, and so on. It can't be denied that if he had wanted to use brutal force to maintain the Soviet empire in Eastern Europe, he could have maintained it for longer, and it could have been potentially a bloodbath. He chose not to use force, and that is to his credit. Even if he was willing to use force, though not willing to use the degree of force that would have maintained the system in uprisings within the Soviet Union itself. And in that sense, he has to be given credit for an historically important moment in Russian history. But internationally, what happened was that he concluded that the Soviet Union was technologically so far behind the United States and the Western nations in general that there was no way that they could keep up with the Cold War competition with the United States, and that this constant threat of a nuclear war between the two countries had to be reduced. So with Ronald Reagan in the White House, he began a set of conferences with Reagan. The upshot of was an agreement to reduce the number of nuclear warheads and missile systems in the two countries, and attempt to demilitarize the relationship between the countries. The consequence was that the Cold War, with the end of the Cold War, which had dominated everything since the Second World War, began to be less dangerous during his term in office from 1985 to 1991 until the end of the Soviet Union. And his willingness to do this as a pragmatic matter. Again, why did he do this? Was he a man of peace and love? Well, some commentators are pointing out that he wanted a less dangerous world. That may very well have been true. But the Soviet economy did not have the ability to technologically keep up with the United States in the Cold War. You couldn't use photocopy machines. You couldn't use computers other than what the central planning agencies and the local operatives of the central planning agencies, as well as the KGB, permitted people to do. You couldn't go just photocopy something. You had to get a permission even to do that. The computer system was primitive compared to what was increasingly available through computer networks in the West. So as a practical, pragmatic matter, there was no way that the Soviet Union was going to be able to keep up with the United States and the West in general in terms of technological know-how to fight a Cold War. That is what motivated him to a great extent to demilitarize international relations so he could try to focus on the domestic betterment of the Soviet economy, both in general as well as to maintain the Soviets' international superpower status through those reforms. Now, so the Soviet Union ended, and everybody talked about a peace dividend, and everybody talked about how this was a new world. The United States and the other Western countries patted themselves on the back. The West won, communism failed. The military strength of the United States has proven its superiority over the evil Soviet Empire. And it was hailed as this was going to be the beginning of a depoliticized world. We're all going to be democratic now. We're all going to be connected economically with market-type economies and civil liberties and international agreements for peace and cooperation. But what this really meant was that following 1991-92, what had been an international conflict between two superpowers basically meant that America was now the unipolar power on the international scene. And those in Washington, D.C., who could have chosen a policy of de-escalation and depoliticization and demilitarization, chose to not to do so. You've written about this recently in the case of John Kennedy and what happened to him. But let me place it in the context of the 1990s as I see it. Two things were at work, in my humble opinion. One is, following the Second World War, there was a mindset in Washington, D.C., and ideas do have consequences, that in an unsafe world, the United States is what Roosevelt said, the arsenal of democracy, but we're expected to prevent these types of cataclysms happening again. And they believed their own rhetoric. They believed that it was desirable for America to police the world in the name of world peace. The other element of this, and this is just the public choice aspect of understanding how government works. Once the government took on the role of world policeman, a massive military industrial complex, you create this vast network of special interest groups, both within the military, in the political establishment, and in the private sector, the armaments industries, and all the other related industries that feed into that. That there would be an immense shock to the system, a loss of power, influence, government contracts, place within the industrial pecking order if the Cold War was to end. And that had to be preserved. It would be like domestically saying, let's get rid of the Social Security system, Medicare and Medicaid, government regulation, and this vast network of special interest groups that have grown up in this intricate spider's web for all of these decades since the New Deal would go berserk because they would see all their rice bowls being taken away. And to prevent this, they would do all in their power in propaganda and in political pressure and in using all ways and means that they could to prevent the demise of the interventionist welfare state at home. So it is not surprising that the same mindset of spider's web of special interest groups in the Pentagon, the political establishment, and the private sector feeding from government spending and contracts when we're determined not to let the Cold War end. You have to find new rationales, new wars to fight, new threatened parts of the world to defend and preserve. And that led to all of these further interventions in the post-Soviet era. From Iraq to Afghanistan to Syria to Libya to all of the to U.S. and NATO intervention in the former Yugoslavia in the mid 1990s. All of these became the rationales, the bases, and the defenses of preserving basically the military welfare warfare state. These people believe their rhetoric. It's like talking to a real communist. He would believe that there was a class conflict and there had to be a revolution. And if you have to kill a lot of people to bring freedom and prosperity to the proletariat, that's the price for world liberation. Well, these people, in my opinion, a lot of them in Washington believe their own rhetoric, that if America doesn't police the world, it's the end of humanity. And on top of that, all of these Private sector and governmental interests will do all in their power to preserve their rice bowls. And that is why, in spite of the end of the Soviet Union and the declared end of the Cold War and our supposed victory, it has become foreign interventionism and war without end. Perpetual war for perpetual peace.
Yeah, that's an excellent summary of Gorbachev and the overall context of the Cold War. You know, it seemed to me, Richard, that one of the big reasons, if not the big reason, for the collapse of the Soviet Union was they couldn't afford it anymore. I mean, there was this huge arms race. Both regimes, the U.S. regime and the Soviet regime, were spending money like it was going out of style. And the U.S. system can support that type of thing because there's a lot more prosperity. There's a bigger base of capital, more taxpayers, or more ability to pay taxes. And so the U.S. could outlast the Soviet Union, and finally it just went bankrupt, which I think is one of the big reasons. It said, we're calling this whole Cold War off. But you know, lost in all this is that the out of control spending, if it can cause bankruptcy in the Soviet Union, why can't it not do the same thing here after a certain point? That lesson's been lost from the beginning because, as you know, the government continues to spend like money was going out of style. The amount of the debt continues to soar. So we're heading in that same direction of national bankruptcy, and unfortunately, U.S. officials didn't grasp that lesson. I also think it's important to put this thing in an overall context of this Cold War, which I consider was a great big racket. I mean, as you say, people really believe this, that the communists were going to come and take us over. So there was really a major structural change in the government. This is what people don't recognize, is that we started out as a limited government republic. What does that mean? It means a government of very few limited powers and very restricted. That's what the Bill of Rights was, especially the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 8th Amendments when it comes to targeting people that the government wants to go after. They have to go through these restrictions, due process of law and right to counsel and so forth. And that was our system. Government was fairly transparent. There was no Espionage Act. There was nobody spying on America because what was there to spy on? You know, congressional sessions were open. The president's activities were open. I mean, it was a fairly transparent regime. People could see what was going on in government. There wasn't all this classified secrets and national security. Well, with the passing of World War II and the so-called communist threat, which ironically was emanating supposedly from Russia, which had been America's partner during World War II, everything changes. As you point out, we get this vast military-industrial complex, a permanent military-industrial complex, ever growing, the Pentagon. And then we also get the CIA. We get the NSA. Everything changes. The whole Bill of Rights, at least the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 8th Amendments, are nullified. They now have the power of assassination. In other words, the power to snuff out a person's life without due process of law, in total contravention to the 5th Amendment. Secret surveillance, indefinite detention, torture. In other words, all the things the communists were doing, but they were doing essentially pretty secretly. And they thought it was going to go on forever. And you'll recall, Richard, when we first discovered libertarianism, or when we first met each other and we talked about the Soviet Union, most everybody agreed that this is going to go on forever. This Cold War, I mean, the Soviets have all the guns. They're never going to let go of the Eastern Europe. We're going to have this thing forever. So what happens in '89 is a tremendous shock to everybody, especially the Pentagon, the CIA, and the NSA, the National Security Establishment. And they freaked out. I remember people were talking about, as you say, the peace dividend, which means it didn't mean a dismantling of the national security state, but it meant drastic reductions in warfare state spending. And they were freaking out. They were saying, oh, wait, no, wait, you still need us. We can fight the drug war, and we can stabilize the world, as you say, police the world. And then they get their favorite buddy, their partner and ally, Saddam Hussein. They use him as the new official enemy. He gets in a fight with with Kuwait. And he had been their partner in the 1980s when he was waging war against Iran, but now they targeted him, and they go into the Middle East. They start killing people, knowing full well that this is going to generate a lot of anger, a lot of hatred for the United States. They'll kill mass numbers of Iraqis, soldiers, and civilians. They destroy the water and treatment plants. They impose this brutal set of sanctions that is killing children decade after decade after decade, hundreds of thousands of children. You've got Madeleine Albright, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, telling 60 Minutes that the deaths of 500,000 Iraqi children has been worth it. And so they're generating all this anger and hatred that manifests itself with terrorist attacks. The 93 attack on the World Trade Center, that guy that killed CIA agents that were driving into CIA headquarters on the road leading up to there, that happened in 93. The attack on the USS Cole. I mean, and people were saying, if you keep killing people in the Middle East, you're going to have a major terrorist attack on American soil. And there was just conscious indifference to that. It was like they knew that, but they said, tough luck, we're going to keep killing people because we want to get rid of Saddam Hussein. We want another pro-U.S. dictator in Iraq. And then so comes 9/11, and man, the national security establishment was off to the races. Now they didn't need Saddam anymore. Now they had the war on terrorism, which was arguably better than the war on communism. And so they use that to invade Afghanistan, which generates this perpetual supply of terrorists because they're killing so many people there. Then Iraq, same thing. But in the process, Richard, what they were doing was very interesting. Having led Gorbachev and the Russians to believe that NATO would just kind of stay where it was. It should have been dismantled. It was this Cold War era dinosaur. But led them to believe, oh, we're just going to stabilize NATO. We'll stay where we are. And the Russians made it clear that we don't want you moving east toward our borders. And so there could have been an opportunity, Richard. There was an opportunity for mutual coexistence with Russia, where there is free trade, where there is interactions between the peoples and so forth. But instead, the national security state, while it's ginning up this war on terrorism stuff, is gradually moving eastward, absorbing former members of the Eastern Pact. Russia kept saying, stop, stop. And their red line was Ukraine. But no, the Pentagon and the CIA pushed all the way up to that red line. And Russia finally says, all right, before you cross it, we're going to invade Ukraine. So now we've come full circle. I mean, it's the best thing that could ever happen to the so-called defense industry. We've got a new Cold War again. Russia's a new official enemy, or old new official enemy. Now China, they're over there provoking them with Taiwan pushing their red line. So we've got the whole Cold War again. I mean, the only thing missing is the communist part of it. And then we've got the war on terrorism. I mean, and of course, the out of control spending for the warfare state, ever expanding budgets for the so-called defense industry. I mean, it's just one great big racket at this point.
Yeah, there's always a dynamic in these things. That once you have a mindset of a belief, you become committed to that, and it's very difficult to reverse it. And particularly when you have those vested interests of special interest groups, of which I was referring to earlier, so that you can't get out of it. For example, how does the United States gracefully withdraw its tacit statement of possibly coming to the defense of Taiwan if the Chinese government were to attempt to invade the island? And it's not even possible. I mean, Biden said directly a couple of months ago that when he was asked by the press, would you have the United States come to the military defense of Taiwan if the Chinese invaded? He said yes. That was about the most direct statement that you could get from a U.S. president about an intention to intervene under a certain circumstance. So now we're committed to this. Now, there have been a number of scenario runs of strategies of a war with China over Taiwan in the Far East. And the one that I saw, maybe some viewers and listeners picked this up in the press too, that there was such 21 scenarios were run with computer runs. You know, respective military strains, presence of forces of various types. In 18 of those 21 computer scenario runs of a conflict between the U.S. and China over Taiwan, it's ambiguous as to whether the Chinese would be defeated. And at a minimum, 900 or more U.S. military sea vessels, destroyers, aircraft, planes, would be wiped out. And, and a large part of the Japanese military forces as well. So, what victory is that? Even in the name of your own strategy, how does it justify and rationalize your own purpose for having a military when, with an ambiguous outcome from all of these computer war strategy runs, in the vast majority of them, the US loses in terms of it is decimated in terms of its military force? Even from their own point of view, if you even stop the Chinese from a successful full occupation of Taiwan, but at that cost, what happens to your view of having the military strength to continue to police the world? Where will your military strength be even to do what you say you want to do in the other parts of the world? This would be a disaster from their own perspective. It would open the floodgates for all of the demons that they say the purpose of the U.S. military is to ward off. So this is like a mindset that is dragging the system in a disastrous direction.
Yeah, and sometimes I think that they're convinced that there's not going to be a war, but they just want the crisis. They want the crisis to keep people all agitated and afraid and be able to point to those bad Chinese, those aggressive Chinese, in order to justify their budgets. I mean, do you really think, Richard, that the Pentagon, the CIA, and the NSA are so, and Biden and Congress are really so concerned about the Taiwanese people? I mean, if they're so concerned about foreigners, why aren't they concerned about people in Vietnam? I mean, why not invade Vietnam again to save those people? They're living under communist tyranny there. I mean, they've already been taken over by the communists. Why not invade there and save them? Or what about the people of Hong Kong? I didn't see an invasion of Hong Kong. The U.S. could have invaded Hong Kong. I'm not saying they should have done that. I'm just saying there's a selective concern about people. What about people in Saudi Arabia suffering under that murderous regime? All I see is fist bumps and camaraderies taking place with that foreign regime. And it's the same elsewhere. That the U.S. has installed brutal, tyrannical regimes. I previously mentioned Iraq's battle against Iran, and that the U.S. was supporting Saddam Hussein. Why were they helping him kill Iranians? Because the Iranians had the audacity to revolt and remove the U.S. installed dictator, the Shah of Iran, that the CIA had installed in a coup when they ousted the democratically elected prime minister of Iran back in '53. So I think what they're mostly interested in is just keeping people agitated, this perpetual crisis environment, to justify their ever increasing control and budgets.
Yeah, it must be, I would argue it needs to be usefully understood that this is a generic mindset. Do the bureaucrats in Washington, D.C., on the domestic side, ever go before a finance committee of the Senate or the House and say, Mr. Senator, Mr. Congressman, that purpose for which you set up our bureau, agency, or department? Mission accomplished. We've solved the problem. And of course, we don't want to do anything dramatic, but let's say over the next 2 or 3 years, you reduce our budget to zero as we just let people go and find productive jobs in the private sector out of our department, bureau, agencies, bureaucracy. No. What happens each cycle? Mr. Senator, Mr. Congressman, that purpose for which you set us up, it's worse than we thought. We've not been able to solve it. If only you allocated more money and more authority and power, we're going to get it right. Or, yeah, we've gotten this problem under control, but only in the process of dealing with the problem for which you set us up do we realize that there are surrounding problems that only our agency has the experience and knowledge and expertise to take on too, and therefore to handle these complementary and related areas for which you said that we needed to exist. We need more money. We need more authority. We need a larger staff. And it goes on unendingly. Well, I would say this to our conservative friends. If you know that this is the shenanigans and the absurdities and the hypocrisy that goes on the domestic side of the welfare and regulatory state, Why would you think that it is any different when we're talking about that part of the U.S. bureaucracy that is in the defense-related industries or in the Pentagon? Mr. Senator, Mr. Congressman, yeah, this world problem has seemed to have settled down or gone away. But there's this other country, there's this other region of the world, there's this other threat. Oh, you can't cut, not just cut, we need more money for the defense budget. We need new armament systems, and we need unendingly. In other words, whether it be domestic policy or foreign policy, those who are eating at the trough of, of taxpayer money through the government of the United States will do all in their power to see that the trough never goes dry.
Well, and that insightful note. Well, I might add, I mean, which is all the more reason why the American people need to go on a journey here, an internal journey of soul searching, and determine, is this the kind of way of life you want to live? Is this what you want for your children and your grandchildren? Perpetual crises, perpetual war for perpetual peace? Or do you want a society that's based on peace and prosperity and harmony with the people of the world? And most important, liberty for ourselves instead of a national security police state here or a drug war police state or what have you. And if we engage in that national soul searching, then we've got a chance to get this country back on the right road to peace, prosperity, liberty, and harmony with the people of the world. So on that note, Richard, we'll wrap things up. We're out of time. Thank you for tuning in. Appreciate you all's support. We've got a mid-year fundraising drive going on. I hope you'll be able to support us. We've got a great conference we're planning for the fall, and consistent with these online Zoom conferences we've been holding. This was going to be on end inflation and end the Fed. Both, which of course they're tied in together, as we'll show during the conference. So in any event, thanks so much, and we'll look forward to seeing you next week. And Richard, greatly enjoyed the visit. See you next week.
Until next time.